Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Underwater Photography Show. As always, I'm Matthew Sullivan.
And I'm Alex Mustard.
And I'm still trying to kick this cold, so if I sound all honky, that's why. But today we're going to do another installment of Behind the Shots. And to Alex's Alex is up today. And we're going to go through three of his black and white pictures that have all been awarded in the Wildlife Photographer of the Year. So the first one we're pulling up here is a reef shark from the Bahamas. So
Yeah.
Alex, if you would like to talk through that picture.
Well, I think the reason I thought this was an interesting thing to cover in this latest Behind the Shot is the fact that I always really enjoyed the black and white category in the wildlife photographer. I have 3 pictures awarded over 15 years or so in that category. But it's also the fact that that category no longer exists, which I feel is is something quite sad. So this is a sort of snapshot in time. I would say that you are still allowed to enter black and white pictures in the wildlife photographer of the year. But I would say since the end of the black and white category, the number of black and white pictures that are awarded in the wildlife photographer has definitely reduced quite a lot. So, it doesn't seem to be, bucking that trend. And I think it's quite a gamble these days to enter a black and white picture there. So it is interesting how, the change of a category in a competition does really influence the amount of these types of images that you see. I'd say all 3 of these, the wildlife photography is quite a specific competition. And I would say that they're not my most spectacular underwater black and whites, but they're images that work well in that competition terms. And obviously the first of these, which is the one that's been on screen while we've been chatting, is the oldest of them. I think this was awarded in 2007, maybe 2007, 2008 time. I don't remember exactly when. Normally I have, I can like look and see if I can spot one of the award certificates around, but because we're moving house hopefully relatively soon, there are no pictures on the wall in my room for me to get information from. Anyway, this was taken in 2006 on a wet pixel organized shark trip with Jim Abernathy Scuba Adventures. And it was one of the very early shark trips we did. And there was still a lot of exploratory diving on those trips. And on one of the days, we decided we'd go up to Walker's Key. And this was after Walker's Key was a resort, fishing and resort island in the north of the Bahamas. And for a long time, they ran a really big reef shark feeding dive over the sand. And they famously had this thing called the chumsicle, if I'm remembering that correctly, where they basically put, all the fish bits into a old garbage can, put that whole garbage can in the freezer, and basically created a huge ice cube full of fish blood and fish bits and pieces, which they then hung from a rope, and the sharks would circle around it and take bites out of it, and then have to swim around, get rid of their ice cream headaches, and come around and have another bite of it again. And anyway, this was when Walker's Key was a big place, and I guess that must have been late 90s, early 2000s. And then a big hurricane went through Walker's Key and basically destroyed the resort, and the resort was just left. It was not worth redeveloping with the damage. And when we went there was just nobody there. And it was and we went to, I think this was the sand patch where they used to do the chumsicle dive. And we went there, put some bait in to see if any sharks would come around. And 1 or 2 fairly timid reef sharks came and cruised through the area. And it was kind of a very chilled out dive. It was quite a nice dive after quite intensive diving with big sharks. And I was really enjoying the fact that I could actually compose a picture for once, because all the other shots had been shot blind for a few days. So with this picture here, I remember at the time going, finally I can compose. And I was really enjoying the fact that I could play around with shapes and things. And that's what, everyone else was down on the seabed shooting the sharks as you normally would. And I just spent, 10 minutes of the dive floating above, just being drawn to these ripples. I turned my flash guns off and just shot available light shots to convert to black and white of shark shapes on the seabed and ripples. And it was that combination that led to this picture. So unusually for me, shot with a non-fisheye lens, shot with the 12-24 on this dive. The settings are pretty standard. D2X, you had to shoot everything at ISO 100, and yeah, just shot with a f11 to keep the corners sharp, and a reasonable shutter speed to get to get everything else in position there. The sand patch was relatively deep, so I think that's helped to stop the picture being dominated by light patterns, in that it was deep enough that you don't have light patterns like behind me here. The light become more diffuse by that depth. And other than that, it was a fairly straightforward picture to take, but it was a very, at the time, it was a very different type of shark picture. In 20 years ago-ish, when this picture was taken, there weren't so many shark dives around the world. There weren't so many shots of sharks like there are now. And, the ones that were coming out, and obviously there were lots of shark dives, tended to focus on in-your-face shots. And this more subtle approach at the time was really quite original. And as a result, that's why it was awarded in the wildlife photographer. And obviously, a picture like this or an aesthetic like this is very easy for other photographers to take on board and do their versions of it. So the idea and the type of shot has been, been reproduced many times by many photographers and taken in other directions, done better, and that sort of thing. But the reason this was awarded is primarily because it was out there first. And it was a very successful image for me at the time. It always sold really well as prints. It was used in advertising as well by several companies. It was used on the BBC. It was used, so it was a really successful image. Even though these days I tend to look at it and it feels fairly pedestrian and, I could knock out 10 of these in the first 5 minutes of a shark dive. But back then it was really, really interesting.
I think you made a good point, though, that just to have a different approach than everybody else on a dive, as everybody else gets down under the sand, because that's your first instinct: get down low, get as close to the sharks as you possibly can. Whereas you're like, I'll hang up here for a little bit and shoot something a little bit different. And I think that still applies it obviously still applies to photography today. If you're trying to do something unique, don't do what everybody else is doing, and maybe do something a little bit different. Even if you're not sure it might work, you never know.
And I think because that was a photographer's trip and it was filled with, very good photographers of the day, I think there was kind of an undertone of competitiveness on the trip, and you always wanted to be, especially because these were the early days of digital still. And for years, you go on trips with other photographers, but because you were shooting slide, it didn't, you weren't judged on how good your pictures were. You judged on how good your stories were after the dive. Whereas when digital came along, suddenly dive boats for the first few years became quite competitive, as everyone had their laptop and everyone downloaded, and it was, you were seeing what other people got, and that hadn't really existed on dive boats before then. So it did create an interesting dynamic, and I think it was quite good in that, if you took it the right way, it encouraged you to go, right, I'm going to try and do something on this dive that's, going to mark me out compared to the other photographers. Right. And then quite a few years later, this picture was awarded in the black and white category as well in the Wildlife Photographer of the Year. This is a picture we referred to briefly in our recent episode on your trip to Isla Mujeres and shooting pelagic species. I showed a color version of this shot. And this picture, the previous one I entered and called it Lone Shark, and the aim of the previous one was to highlight, in a visual way, the peril that shark populations face. And this one was all about, I called it something like Friendly Shark, but they gave it a different name. But it was very much about the size of the animal, the biggest fish in the sea. And it's particularly how great that bow wave looks on the front of it that I think people really responded to. And obviously you've got the bow wave at the front and you've got the beams of light at the back. And I think those things visually are very arresting. It's a very graphically powerful, simple image, but it's got nice details in. You've got the patterns on the edge of Snell's window. You've got beautiful sunbeams. You've got a couple of remoras hanging around. You've got the bow wave. You've got the silhouette of the shark. All that said, there's a couple of kind of, the amusing side of this story is I remember in my pre-trip email to the group saying to the group, don't get obsessed with silhouette shots of the sharks. Now, I know that the rules have changed now and you're not allowed to dive down.
Yep.
But it wasn't very difficult to, when the shark's coming towards you and moving quite quickly, as this one is, to basically take a breath, dive down to, 15, 20 feet, 5 meters or 6 meters or so, and stay there for 10 seconds while the shark went over your head. And then you popped up the other side of the shark. It was, it wasn't a difficult thing to do. But a lot of photographers, it was kind of, a lot of the silhouette shots of the sharks were really ugly because people would get underneath the middle of the shark with a fisheye lens, and you'd end up with a shark that was basically all belly and then had a little head at one end, a little tail at the other, and it looked really, really ugly. And so I've been saying to the group, don't do lots of silhouettes, because have a look at the silhouettes other photographers have done before the trip and ask yourself, do you really want that picture? And everyone was like, yeah, they're all really, really ugly. And what I was saying is, it wouldn't be great if you had a shark dive out of the sun down towards you, and then you'd get a really cool silhouette, and that would be worth shooting. And I was like, oh, that will never happen. And then what I realized is, when we went out there really early in the morning, the sun was low enough to the horizon, low enough on the edge of Snell's window, that if you had the shark coming in the right direction, you could actually have the shark coming more towards the camera and create this more pleasing silhouette. So the reason that this silhouette looks nice is that the shark is coming towards the camera. I'm not directly beneath the shark. I'm actually in front of the shark, and the sun is low to the horizon. And that's kind of, what I kind of figured out was that early in the morning, when the sun was low, it was on the edge of Snell's window, and therefore I could get a shark as it transitioned. So it's not yet above my head. It's actually kind of at about 45 degrees up above me, but it's still blocking the sun out. So all we had to do was find sharks that were coming basically directly out of the sun. And so it involved a lot of swimming around, waiting for the perfect pass. And I got maybe 3 decent silhouette shots in the whole trip. But because I knew exactly what I wanted, when I had a shark coming the right way, I would make those changes, so I set up the silhouette shot and then dive down and get it. So although it's a very technically simple shot, actually the detail of getting it exactly right came about by realizing, and the discussion with the group about how the fact that most silhouettes of the whale sharks were very unflattering. And what we wanted was this coming towards the camera look that led to this shot. So I think there is a bit of detail in there.
I think it's interesting what you just said about it being it's a technically simple image, but so many pictures are technically simple after you've done all the work beforehand to figure out settings, angles, behaviors, all that kind of thing. So even though it might look like you would, if I didn't know better, you'd look at this picture and be like, oh yeah, simple silhouette. Like you said, just dive down, shoot up, and you're good to go. But there's so much more behind a picture than just the actual image, even if it looks simple, which I think often gets overlooked in terms of photography.
Yeah. And the key things that, we realized, because we were, I was leading the trip, but we were discussing it as a group. Yeah. And we realized was that we wanted to do these silhouette shots in that first hour of the day that we were out there. It was, we'd leave a little bit after dawn, but, by the time we were out there, the sun was still low to the horizon. And we had to have the shark coming from the direction of the sun. So you'd spot a fin on the surface, and you'd line yourself up so that it was coming out of the sun. And you can see that the sun is completely symmetrically behind the shark here. It's right. The sun is, just in from the edge of Snell's window to make the picture work. The other factor that was really important for this shot is that it was taken with a micro four thirds picture. And it's my understanding that this is the first mirrorless picture that was awarded in the Wildlife Photographer of the Year, which I'm not just underwater mirrorless, but topside and underwater mirrorless. So I'm always quite proud of that as claiming my mirrorless status. But it was nothing to do with the fact that the camera was mirrorless. It was actually because the camera was small. And that really made a difference to how I could position myself in the water. And, you were talking about on your trip how much you valued having the Nikonos 30mm wide angle because it was small footprint and it made you much more maneuverable in the water. Going to the micro four thirds housing for this was really, really valuable for being able to get my camera into the right position to get the shot, because I was just so mobile in the water because I didn't have a great big SLR to drag through the water. And as a result, that made a big difference to me getting the shot.
You did say something too about the sun being perfectly symmetrical, and that's what I think that's true, because there's so many times where you see pictures that could be, they're so close to being perfect silhouettes, but there's part of the sun isn't blocked. So then it's the brightest part of the frame. You immediately end up looking at it, and it kind of ruins the symmetry of the picture. So I think that's
yeah, and I think the small housing helped. I mean, the main thing was the fact that it was time of day. The shark had to be coming from the right direction, but it was also being able to make those small adjustments in the water because I was so mobile because of not having the big rig. Right, the last one is the most recent one. And I think this one is, I mean, it's probably, is certainly photographically my favorite of the three images. It's also a very memorable picture because the year that this was awarded, the wildlife photographer had a mini exhibition during the awards at 10 Downing Street, which is the Prime Minister's residence here in the UK. And a small number of the winning photographers, it certainly wasn't all, had our pictures on display there. They had about 20 pictures up. So they had some of the category winners and some of the other pictures that they thought represented the contest well. And the photographers whose pictures were chosen were invited to go to 10 Downing Street, which is, it's very cool to visit, the place which has been the Prime Minister's residence of my country for so many years. But in addition to that, I got to go there because one of the other winning photographers was David Dubay, who I'd never really met. He'd come and given the occasional talk in the UK, but I'd been away when he was doing them. I'd gone and spoken in the States, but he wasn't at the DEMAs that I'd been to or the ADEXs that I'd been to. So I'd never actually bumped into him sort of, in all the years. I think I'd been to the odd show where he was there, but I'd never spoken to him. So it was very cool that the first time I had a proper conversation with him was in 10 Downing Street, which was just the most amazing place to me. Unfortunately, our Prime Minister at the time was a chap called Boris Johnson, who didn't cover himself in glory. And so, David was very respectful of 10 Downing Street and past British Prime Ministers like Winston Churchill and things who'd been our Prime Minister during the war. I was rather less keen to go there because of my disdain for our current Prime Minister. In the same way that you can imagine with some of your recent presidents, it wouldn't be quite the same going to the White House when some presidents are in office compared to others. So as a result, but anyway, the whole experience of that was just fantastic. And those are the amazing doors that, a contest like the Wildlife Photographer opens. And so that was really fantastic. Photographically, this picture was shot in the Red Sea during one of my Red Sea workshops. This was taken, I normally run my Red Sea workshops in June, but in the year I took this, which I think was 2018, I decided to run one workshop week in June and one in September. And I must have had another trip on or something, and that's why I split them up. But I also wanted to go to the Red Sea when it was really warm and we could just dive in rash vests all the time, which you can do in September. And so I was kind of keen to do that. And one of the things that was different in September is the schooling fish action was slightly different. And there was this really big school of these big ice trevally, which gave me the opportunity to create this image. And this is a picture of a school of fish. And obviously the other aspect of this is, one of David Dubay's most famous pictures is a spiral of barracuda taken in Papua New Guinea. And his is a picture taken the more classic way of being underneath the school looking up. And it's one of the most iconic underwater pictures. So that was also cool to have this shot, which obviously has, elements that are clearly inspired by his shot. But because it's a downward looking shot, it's got a very different feel, and being presented in black and white, I think it works really well. And this picture looked incredible in the exhibition. It was in the days where they had the really nice dark room and the backlit prints, which sadly they've gone away from in recent years there. And it just looked like this massive eye staring at you from across the room. And it just got so much attention that year because it would just, people would walk in and they whoever laid the exhibition out realized this and positioned it in the room so that it worked like that. And it just, so many people would come in, see it across the room, and then just walk straight across to the black and white section because of this picture. So yeah, it's one I'm really pleased with. It was taken with the WACP and kind of one of the relatively early in the WACP's life. So I think Nauticam also were very, very pleased to see, the quality of the WACP revealed in this competition, and particularly in the big prints. It looks fantastic, shot with the D850 and the WACP. Because it was WACP, I shot it a little bit more open than usual. It's not shot with that faster shutter speed because the jacks are lit both with my strobes and with the ambient light. If you see actually on my website, there's the blue version of this shot, the ambient light, or the non-black and white version. And what that version has is you've got this dark blue water and then silver fish. And obviously I changed that into black and white in the processing and made the water black to make the fish stand out. But yeah, it's a really special shot for me, and definitely my favorite of these three black and whites. Right. That's me done, and that's certainly my thoughts on those three. I don't know if you've got any final wrap-up questions. Or you can just say goodbye.
My only comment was that I think of the three of them, I think I prefer the whale shark one, but that could be recency bias since by the time this comes out, I've just gotten back from Mexico with the whale sharks, and also the fact that picture you can't get anymore, which I think will help it stand the test of time a little bit, even more.
Yeah, and I didn't realize that until you told me, actually. I didn't realize they'd changed that aspect of the rules.
Yeah.
And I have to say that, diving down below them, if you do it, properly, the sharks don't even notice.
Yeah.
Because you basically drop down before they're really anywhere close to you. You don't want to just skim just underneath the belly. But of course, if you let people dive down, you might have people who are not so experienced at diving down, and then you've got people surfacing into them and things. So I can understand it's a sensible rule.
Yeah, I think it's a safety for people and less harassment for the sharks, and I think that's what they're going for these days, which makes sense. But for photography purposes, it is a little bit limiting. So I think that's probably why that your whale shark image of these three is probably my favorite.
Cool. Right. Well, we'll be back again soon with another one of these because we need to see three of Matthew's pictures as well. So thanks for watching, everyone, and we'll be back soon.